Episode 36, The Wrecking Yard. These days, the work environment is so competitive that without a college degree or a relevant skill set, it gets very difficult to find a job. This was also the case for Brad, who tried for months to secure a job after he was laid off from his previous workplace. Brad's stress level grew by the day as his wife also wasn't working after giving birth recently. They argued regularly about the family's finances, and as he was so stressed, sometimes he thought about how much better his life would be if he had no wife and child. One day, as Brad was looking through the classified ads in the papers, he saw an opening for the role of a security officer at a wrecking yard. Seeing how he had never tried that line of work before, Brad decided to just call the number on the ad. Brad secured an interview, and after a brief interview session, he was surprised when they told him that they were in urgent need of a replacement and wanted him to start work the following night. Brad agreed, and the following night the manager brought Brad to the wrecking yard and was told that his job was to ensure that no one trespassed into the vicinity. The manager then left the place, leaving Brad alone for his night duties. Brad looked out at the yard and thought to himself that it actually felt peaceful to be working alone at night. As it was already 10 p.m., Brad exited his post to begin his first set of rounds. Brad walked towards the field and approached several rows of vehicles in front of him. Although some of the vehicles had only minor dents on them, Brad also saw that there were others that were completely smashed, and he knew that there was no way that the drivers and passengers had survived. Brad continued walking past the rows of vehicles, and after seeing that there were no trespassers, Brad went back to his post to rest. Brad then began thinking to himself about those who lost their lives and the pain that they had to go through. Brad also thought about how devastated their families must have felt after hearing the news. As Brad had all these thoughts, he suddenly realized that it was midnight and it was time for his next set of rounds. Brad walked out of his post again, and as he passed the second row of vehicles, he noticed an elderly man ahead in the distance, walking in the same direction as him. The man didn't look like he was sneakily trespassing the yard. Instead, he looked like someone strolling along the path as though he was meant to be there. As it was only his first day on the job, and seeing how the man was neatly dressed in a collared shirt and pants, Brad thought that there was possibly another department working at night that the manager never told about earlier. Brad then called out and said, "Hello, sir." As there wasn't any response, Brad walked faster towards him and eventually caught up to the man. That was when Brad saw a lifeless expression on the man's face, who made no attempt to look back at Brad. To break the silence, Brad said, "Hi, sir. Are you a staff member here? I'm Brad, and it's my first day here, so I'm not sure of who else works here," as he was still wary of the man's presence at the yard. Finally, the elderly man replied and said, "Yes, young man. I'm Jim, and I've been here for over 20 years. I'm always here to check on the vehicles at night, to make sure that there are no remains left in any of the cars." "Oh, wow, 20 years must have given you a great amount of experience. But do you ever get bored of doing this?" asked Brad as he tried being casual, but still assessing if Jim indeed wasn't a trespasser. "I've been here for so long, young man. This is my routine every single night. I don't really need the money anymore. I do this to curb the emptiness at home. My nights spending out here in the peaceful yard is better than being cooped up at home alone. Tossing and turning, trying to sleep, I hate it." By now, Brad was less wary, seeing how harmless Jim seemed. Even though he still wasn't sure if Jim worked there, Brad knew that Jim wouldn't cause any problems. Brad then suddenly recalled a question he had been dying to ask and said, "Do you know what happened to the previous night shift security officer, sir?" Jim then said, "I don't know. Maybe he's afraid of working the nights, or maybe he's bored of entertaining my conversations." "Oh? Why afraid, sir?" asked Brad. Jim just smiled and said, "The spirits. But they don't disturb anyone. They are just wandering victims of the accident vehicles here. They were just going about their everyday lives, when one day an accident took them away from this world in an instant. And what makes them sad is that they didn't get the chance to say goodbye to their loved ones." Brad kept silent as it suddenly sparked his thoughts about his own family. The pair continued their walk, and before he knew it, Brad had already completed his rounds. Brad then said, "Okay, sir, I'm heading back to my security post. How about you? Are you heading back to your own rest area?" "No, I'm done for tonight, so I guess I'll go home soon," said Jim. Feeling less suspicious now about Jim's presence, Brad also felt a sense of pity that Jim would feel lonely if he were to go home. So Brad said, "Would you like to join me at my rest area, sir? We can continue chatting there." The man gave a brief reply and said, "Okay, sure." The pair went to the security post and continued chatting about their personal lives. That was when Jim opened up and said, "I miss my wife. We have no kids. So she was the only person I had. It's been 20 years now since our accident, and I regret every single day that I was careless with my driving. I miss you, my dear." The man then let out a loud sigh before staring into space. Although he had plenty of questions about Jim's accident, Brad just kept quiet as he felt very sorry for Jim. But as it was already 4 a.m., Brad, who was still adjusting to the night shift, told Jim that he needed to take a short nap. Brad napped for about a half an hour, and when he woke up, Jim was no longer there. Brad thought that Jim had probably left the vicinity while he was asleep. So he got up and walked around the area to conduct his rounds, but at the same time tried to see if Jim was still there. However, after about an hour of walking, Jim was nowhere to be found. It was already 6 a.m. and Carl, the morning shift duty officer, had also just arrived. He saw Brad in the middle of the yard, and upon seeing how Brad was looking around confused, Carl then asked, "Hey, you're the new night officer. Are you looking for something?" "Oh, hey, yes, I'm Brad, and I was actually looking around for an elderly man named Jim," said Brad. Brad then shared with Carl about the details of his experience with Jim. Casually, Carl said, "Oh, Jim, yes, I've heard about him walking around countless times. But the experience of our night duty officers were different. Some of the officers faced a scary version of Jim, while others faced the kind version." Brad didn't understand what Carl meant by scary, so he asked, "Does he work here? What department does he work in?" Carl just smiled and said, "If you really haven't noticed it by now, he's not a person, at least not anymore. Our senior staff members shared that Jim and his wife were actually one of the accident victims of the cars here some 20 years ago, and both of them succumbed to their injuries and passed away." Shocked at what Carl had just told him, Brad stayed quiet and just thought about the experience he had with Jim throughout the night. Brad could hardly believe how real the interactions felt, and what Jim had said about missing his wife through an accident 20 years ago. It made so much sense to Brad now. Carl then continued, "And that's why the previous night officer resigned. He was terribly disturbed by Jim over the few months he worked here. And my guess about why he was getting haunted was because he was arrogant and rude toward others. From what I've seen over the years, those who Jim treated nicely were genuinely nice people. But They too decided to resign upon knowing that Jim was actually a spirit. Brad then finally replied and said, "I guess they were not willing to go through such interactions over and over again, pretending that everything is okay, when in fact they were actually talking to a spirit." Brad went home that morning and thought endlessly about it. But eventually, remembering how Jim meant no harm to him and the fact that he liked how peaceful it was, Brad decided to continue with his job. Over the next few weeks, Brad would come across Jim and just smiled without much interactions, as he now knew that Jim wasn't real. But unexpectedly, one night, Jim appeared in front of the security post while Brad was taking a break and said, "Thanks, young man, for being so nice and willingly listened, even though I'm just a lingering spirit. Thank you so much, but I guess it's time now." Unsure what Jim meant by saying that, "It's time now," Brad was nervous, but calm. Jim then walked away and towards the yard, behind one of the vehicles. Brad no longer saw Jim since that day. Brad felt that Jim was probably satisfied to have poured out all his regrets, and felt that it was, finally, time to leave this world. Brad always remembered the conversation he had with Jim that night, and how Jim reminded him of treasuring his loved ones, as he would never know when they would be gone. Brad's relationship with his wife gradually improved over time as they fought less and created more happy memories together. All thanks to Jim, the man from his job at the wreckage yard.